The morning after, no one spoke. They stood in the wind, boots sinking into the frozen crust, breath cutting sharp white lines through the cold air, and stared at what was left of the camp. Canvas shredded, poles snapped flush to the ground, supply crates buried under 3 feet of packed ice and debris. The storm had not been selective. It had gone through that campsite like a judgment. Every shelter was gone. Every shelter but one. It sat there low and dark against the white hillside, almost embarrassingly intact. No torn edges, no collapsed frame, just a slow curl of smoke rising from a small opening near the base, patient, unhurried, as if the last 72 hours had been nothing more than a change in weather. Inside, 7 people were still alive, still warm. The structure that saved them did not look like much from the outside. It never had. In the weeks before the storm, more than a few men had walked past it with something between confusion and contempt. One local account recalls a group of workers calling it the ugliest thing ever built on this mountain. Another report suggests bets were placed on how fast it would collapse in the first serious wind. What nobody understood, what nobody had stopped long enough to figure out, was what was actually happening inside those walls. Not the shape, not the metal frame underneath. Something else entirely. Something older than that shelter, older than the tools used to build it, older than most of the building traditions those men had grown up trusting. The secret was not in the structure itself. It was in what he had buried into it. This is the story of a decision that looked pointless in September and kept 7 people alive through the worst 10 days that valley had seen in 40 years. If you want to understand how it worked, really understand it, stay with us. And before we get into it, go ahead and subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It genuinely helps to know who's out there. The valley had been occupied since late August. A survey crew of 9 men had moved into the site just before the first cold front rolled down from the northern ridgeline. 11 miles of exposed terrain between them and the nearest road, no radio relay strong enough to reach past the canyon walls, and a supply schedule that depended entirely on the weather cooperating. It usually did until late October. Usually, the camp itself was a practical arrangement. 5 canvas wall tents, each staked into the frozen ground with iron pins, reinforced along the ridgelines with paracord and timber poles cut from the surrounding spruce stands. Standard issue for high-altitude survey work in that era. Proven design. Lightweight enough to be packed out in a single trip if conditions turned. Most of the crew had used the same configuration across 2 or 3 previous seasons without a single serious failure. There was no reason, on paper, to do anything differently, except that one man did. His name was Callum, mid-40s, lean from a lifetime of field work, with the particular kind of quiet that comes not from shyness, but from having spent too many seasons reading terrain to bother with unnecessary conversation. He had joined the survey team as a senior technician, experienced, dependable, not given to dramatic gestures, which is why what he spent his first week building made no immediate sense to anyone watching. While the rest of the crew pitched tents and organized equipment, Callum had requested the single prefabricated Quonset hut that had been dropped with the supply load, a surplus military unit, half-cylinder in shape, roughly 16 feet long and 8 feet across at its widest point. The ribbed steel frame was designed to be assembled by 2 men in under an hour. It went up without incident on the first afternoon. Then Callum kept building. He began pulling stones from the hillside above camp, not the loose shale near the surface. That material fractures unpredictably under freeze-thaw cycles and holds almost no useful mass. He was looking for something specific, dense, dark-faced fieldstone, the kind that had been sitting below the frost line long enough to carry real thermal weight. He found a seam of it about 40 yards up the slope, where natural outcrop had been undercut by centuries of snowmelt. The pieces ran between 12 and 30 pounds each, angular enough to stack without mortar, but substantial enough to stay put under pressure. He began moving them down the hill in a canvas sling, one load at a time. By the 3rd day, he had relocated an estimated 2 to 3 tons of fieldstone to the base of the Quonset. By the 5th day, he had begun stacking them against the outer shell, 2 courses deep along the lower walls, packed tight with smaller rubble filled between the steel ribs and the stone face. The work was slow, physical, and appeared, from every practical standpoint the other crew members could identify, completely unnecessary. The tents were already up. The season was already underway. Time spent hauling rocks was time not spent on survey work. One of the younger crew members, a man named Price, reportedly asked Callum directly what he was building. Oral accounts from a later debrief suggest Callum's answer was brief, something that remembers heat. Price reportedly walked away without a follow-up question, unsure whether the answer was meant seriously. It was what Callum understood, and what would not be obvious to anyone watching him stack stones in the September sun, was that he was not reinforcing a shelter. He was constructing a thermal battery, one that would take weeks to fully charge, and whose true function would only become visible when everything else in that camp had already failed. The tents looked better. They were faster. They were lighter. They were everything a field shelter was supposed to be, but they were, in the most fundamental physical sense, weightless. They had no memory. When the air inside them went cold, there was nothing to push back. No stored energy, no latent heat, no mass to slow the decline. They would follow the outside temperature with painful faithfulness, and on the night the storm arrived, that faithfulness would cost them everything. Callum's structure, by contrast, had been accumulating heat for 6 weeks. The stone around that Quonset had been absorbing sun during every clear sky afternoon since late August. Dense field stone of that type, basalt adjacent, high mineral density, can store between 20 and 28 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit of temperature change. At 2 tons of material, that represented a thermal reservoir that no canvas wall could come close to matching. The math was simple. The implications were not obvious until the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 18 hours. That would come later. For now, the camp looked normal. The tents stood in a row. The Quonset sat at the edge of the site, half buried in stone, ungainly and oversized and quietly, patiently filling itself with heat. Nobody paid it much attention. To understand why Callum chose the Quonset hut as his foundation, rather than building a traditional square structure, you have to go back about 40 years before that survey camp was established to a different kind of emergency entirely. The Quonset hut was born out of necessity during the early 1940s, when the United States military needed a shelter that could be mass-produced, shipped in flat-pack crates, assembled by non-specialists in under 2 hours, and perform reliably across an extraordinary range of climates, from the equatorial Pacific to the subarctic Aleutian Islands. The design that emerged from that brief was elegantly simple. A half-cylinder of corrugated steel, arched from ground to peak, with no internal load-bearing walls and no complex joinery. 2 men, a handful of bolts, and a set of printed instructions were all it required. The shape was not chosen for aesthetics. It was chosen because the arch is one of the most mechanically efficient geometries in structural engineering. Here is why that matters in a storm. A flat-walled tent or a boxy plywood structure presents what engineers call a flat pressure face to incoming wind. When a gust hits a vertical wall directly, the full force of that pressure transfers into the wall surface, and that force scales with velocity in a nonlinear way. Wind speed doubling does not double the load on the wall. It quadruples it. In a sustained storm with gusts reaching 60 to 70 miles per hour, that is a tremendous amount of lateral force pushing against a flat plane. The arch distributes that force differently. When wind strikes a curved surface, the pressure does not concentrate at a single point. It deflects. The airflow wraps around the curve, loses coherence, and the effective load on any given section of the shell is dramatically reduced. Naval architects and bridge engineers have understood this principle for centuries. The Quonset shape applies it to a portable shelter. In high wind conditions, the half-cylinder does not fight the storm. It shrugs. That is why the Quonset frame was still standing when the wall tents were not. But the geometry alone would not have been enough. This is the piece of the story that is easy to miss. A bare Quonset hut, without modification, is a poor thermal performer. The corrugated steel shell that makes it structurally efficient is also an almost perfect conductor of heat loss. Steel has extremely low thermal resistance, what builders call R value. A thin steel wall has an R value somewhere between 0.003 and 0.01 per inch. That is effectively nothing. In practical terms, a bare metal Quonset hut is a shelter that equalizes with the outside temperature very quickly. It keeps the wind off. It keeps the snow off, but it does not hold heat. On a night when the temperature drops to 5 degrees Fahrenheit or below, a bare Quonset hut without supplemental heating becomes a refrigerator with a door. Callum knew this, which is exactly why the shape, by itself, was never his plan. The arch was the skeleton. The stone was the organ. The Quonset gave him a frame that could survive the wind loading, a structural platform that would remain upright and intact regardless of what the storm threw at it. But the thermal function, the actual life-sustaining warmth that would carry 7 people through 10 days of sub-zero conditions, that came entirely from the material he had chosen to pack around it. What the military engineers who designed the Quonset had optimized for was transport, speed, and structural performance. What they had not solved was the cold. Field units in the Aleutians and in Alaska during the war years supplemented bare Quonsets with every insulating material available: sandbags, earth berms, lumber scraps, parachute silk between the ribs. The improvisation was constant, and the principle was always the same: add mass, add resistance, slow the thermal exchange between inside and outside. Callum was doing exactly that. He was just doing it with more intentionality than most, and with a material that had specific thermal properties the lighter alternatives could not match. Stone does not just insulate. It absorbs, stores, and radiates. Those are 3 distinct thermal behaviors, and all 3 are present simultaneously in dense fieldstone used as a building envelope. The stone was slowing the loss of interior heat, yes, but it was also acting as a second heat source in its own right, radiating the energy it had collected over the preceding weeks back into the interior air whenever the temperature differential favored it. The Quonset gave Callum a frame that would not fall down. The stone gave that frame a thermal personality. Together, they created something the individual components could not have managed alone, a shelter that was both mechanically resilient and thermally responsive. One that could take a sustained beating from the outside and keep its interior state more or less intact regardless of what the weather decided to do. That combination was not an accident. It was the result of someone who had thought carefully about what a shelter actually needs to do, not just on a clear night, but on the worst night that terrain could produce. The worst night, as it turned out, was about 3 weeks away. By the second week of September, the stone wall around the Quonset had reached approximately 4 feet in height along the lower 2/3 of the structure. Callum was working in the mornings before the survey team departed for the day, and again in the evenings after the equipment was stowed. The work was quiet, methodical, and, to the rest of the crew, increasingly strange. The initial curiosity had given way to something more pointed. The camp operated on the unspoken hierarchy common to field survey teams. Efficiency was the primary currency, and anything that consumed time without producing measurable output was, at best, an eccentricity. At worst, it was a liability, a signal that someone was not pulling their weight in the ways that counted. Callum's stone hauling fell into an uncomfortable middle category. He was still completing his technical work on time. His data logs were clean. He wasn't asking anyone to help him. But the project itself, the slow, heavy, apparently purposeless accumulation of rock around a prefabricated metal hut, was difficult to read charitably when you were tired at the end of a long survey day. Price, the youngest member of the crew, had appointed himself the informal voice of that skepticism. He was not cruel about it. The comments were the kind that travel well in small groups. Dry, rhetorical, delivered with a grin that made them plausibly deniable if taken poorly. Building a castle, are we, was reportedly one of them, delivered on a morning when Callum was maneuvering a particularly awkward piece of stone down the slope in a canvas sling. Another account mentions a remark about whether Callum was expecting the mountain to attack. The laughter that followed these comments was not mean-spirited. It was the laughter of people who could not imagine a practical reason for what they were seeing, and who filled that gap with humor because it was easier than asking a serious question. The crew chief, a man named Orrin, weathered and methodical, with 22 years of high-altitude field experience, watched the stone project without comment for the first 10 days. On the 11th day, he reportedly walked over to where Callum was working and stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, looking at the half-finished wall. "You know something about this season I don't?" he asked. Callum set down the stone he was carrying and looked at the ridge to the north. "The snowpack on the upper bowl was 3 feet deeper than average in July," he said. "When the pack is that heavy going into fall, the temperature drops fast, and it drops early. The canyon funnels northwest winds straight into this site. Canvas won't hold that." Orrin looked at the tents, then back at the stone wall. He did not say anything else. He walked back to the supply cache and resumed his inventory. He did not order Callum to stop. He also did not ask any more questions. What Orrin understood intuitively, and what the rest of the crew did not yet have the reference points to see, was that Callum was not building a wall. He was solving a problem that had not announced itself yet. High-altitude field work selects for a particular kind of pattern recognition, the ability to read terrain, weather history, and material behavior across time, and to make decisions based on probabilities that exist weeks or months before they become visible. Callum had been doing that work for over 2 decades. He had seen canvas tents fail in November storms. He had spent long enough above the tree line in conditions that were supposed to be manageable to develop a deep and personal skepticism about the word supposed. The stone was his response to that skepticism. But there was also something more specific in his material choice, something beyond the general logic of more mass is better. Callum had selected his stones carefully, and the selection process was not random. He was avoiding shale and sedimentary flake rock, which absorb moisture, fracture unpredictably under freezing temperatures, and tend to lose structural cohesion when repeatedly cycled through freeze and thaw. Instead, he was pulling dense, fine-grained igneous and metamorphic material, the kind of stone that had been compressed and recrystallized under geological pressure into something close to uniform density throughout. That density matters thermally. A pound of granite or dense basalt holds roughly 0.19 to 0.21 BTUs of heat energy per degree Fahrenheit, what physicists call specific heat capacity. That number may not sound impressive in isolation, but when you multiply it across 2 tons of material, approximately 4,000 pounds, and consider that those stones have been sitting in full afternoon sun at that elevation for 6 weeks, the numbers become significant. Stone at that altitude in September can reach surface temperatures of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or above on clear afternoons, while the interior mass stabilizes somewhere between 55 degrees Fahrenheit and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on exposure and stone thickness. That stored energy was not going anywhere quickly, and that was the entire point. The tents, meanwhile, had 0 thermal storage. Their interior temperature tracked the outside air with a lag measured in minutes. Every morning they were cold. Every evening they required active heating to be habitable. Every BTU produced by the camp stoves inside those tents went straight through the canvas and into the outside air within hours. The tents were, thermally speaking, transparent. The stone around the Quonset was, thermally speaking, a vault. Price would stop making jokes about the castle in late October. By then, he would have a more pressing concern, staying alive inside it. There is a concept in building science called thermal lag, and it is one of the least understood ideas in the entire history of shelter construction. Most people think about insulation in simple terms. A material either lets heat through or it doesn't. The thicker and fluffier the barrier, the better it performs. Canvas is thin, so it fails. Wool is thick, so it helps. That model is intuitive and partially correct, but it misses something fundamental, something that separates passive insulation from active thermal storage. It misses the behavior of mass. Thermal lag is the delay between when a temperature change occurs on one side of a material and when that change is felt on the other side. In a canvas tent wall, that lag is measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. The outside drops to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the inside follows almost immediately because the canvas has almost no capacity to absorb or retain energy. It is a membrane, not a reservoir. It separates inside from outside, the way paper separates two rooms. Technically present, practically irrelevant at extreme temperatures. Dense stone behaves in an entirely different category. A fieldstone wall, 12 to 18 inches thick, the approximate depth Callum achieved with his two-course stacking method, can produce a thermal lag of 8 to 14 hours under the right conditions. What that means in practice is this. If the outside temperature begins dropping sharply at noon, the interior surface of that stone wall may not register the full effect of that drop until midnight or later. The stone absorbs the incoming cold the way a sponge absorbs water, slowly, through its full depth, rather than transmitting it instantly as a thin material would. But the lag effect works in both directions. During the 6 weeks of sun exposure before the storm arrived, Callum's stone wall had been doing something invisible and patient. It had been charging. Every afternoon when the sun struck those dark-faced stones directly, the surface layers absorbed radiant energy and conducted it inward, degree by degree, into the thermal mass of the wall. By the time the temperature dropped each evening, the outermost stones were releasing that captured energy back into the cold air, but the deeper layers were still holding it. Over days and weeks, the average stored temperature of the stone mass climbed slowly toward a stable value somewhere between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 60 degrees Fahrenheit throughout its full depth, regardless of what the air temperature was doing overnight. That stored warmth had nowhere to go quickly. This is the mechanism that insulates a stone building far better than its R value alone would suggest. Measured in a laboratory at a single moment in time, dense granite or basalt performs modestly as a pure thermal resistor. Its R value per inch is roughly 0.2 to 0.3, which is far below modern fiberglass bats or spray foam. Engineers focused on that number in isolation sometimes dismiss stone as a poor insulating material. Technically, they are not wrong, but they are asking the wrong question. R value measures resistance to heat flow at a static moment. It does not measure the capacity to store energy over time, or the rate at which that stored energy is released back into a space when the exterior temperature drops below the interior mass temperature. Stone walls in traditional construction, Roman hypocausts, Scottish black houses, Pueblo adobe structures, the thick-walled longhouses of the eastern woodland peoples, all relied on this same principle. They were not trying to stop heat from moving. They were trying to slow it down so dramatically that the building could coast through cold periods on stored energy alone, the way a flywheel coasts on momentum after the engine stops. Callum's Quonset was a flywheel, and there was a second mechanism operating in parallel, one that would become critical during the storm itself: radiant heat transfer from stone air. When a cold air mass moves through a heated space, which happens constantly during the kind of wind infiltration that even a well-sealed shelter experiences during a sustained storm, convective heating from a stove or fire struggles to keep pace. The stove heats air directly above and around it, but that heated air rises, mixes with infiltrating cold air, and the temperature throughout the shelter fluctuates constantly. This is why tent campers describe the same phenomenon. You can feel the cold moving across the floor even with the stove running at full output. The stove cannot heat the room faster than the cold air replaces the warm. Stone radiates differently. A stone wall at 55 degrees Fahrenheit in a space where the air temperature has dropped to 35 degrees Fahrenheit will radiate heat continuously and silently from its entire surface area, warming objects and people on a line-of-sight basis regardless of what the air is doing. Radiant heat does not depend on air movement. It does not rise to the ceiling and escape. It reaches across space and warms whatever is in front of it: sleeping bags, human bodies, clothing, the interior metal shell of the Quonset itself, directly at a rate determined by the temperature differential between the radiating surface and the receiving object. Inside Callum's shelter, the stone was not just slowing the cold down. It was actively pushing back against it, radiating stored solar energy inward hour after hour without requiring any additional fuel. This was not intuition. It was physics. And it was physics that Callum had understood long before any storm was on the forecast. When the wind finally arrived at that valley, cold, hard, sustained, and far earlier than anyone except Callum had anticipated, those thermal mechanisms were already fully charged and waiting. The thermal battery had been building toward its discharge moment for 6 weeks. The storm was about to trigger it. The first sign came not from the sky, but from the ground. On the morning of October 19th, the soil at the camp's perimeter had frozen an additional 3 inches deeper than the previous week's measurement, a shift that Callum noted in his field log without comment, but which Oren reportedly did not record at all, focused as he was on the survey backlog. By midday, the ridgeline to the northwest had disappeared behind a wall of cloud that was not quite the color of a normal overcast. It was the particular gray-green shade that high-altitude veterans describe as pressure gray, a sky that is not just cloudy but loaded, the atmosphere compressing under the weight of a system large enough to have its own gravitational influence on the air beneath it. The temperature dropped 11 degrees between noon and 3 in the afternoon. At 4:45 p.m., Oren made the call to suspend field operations and secure equipment. By that point, Callum had already been back at camp for 2 hours, moving his remaining personal gear and supply cache inside the Quonset. He had also made a decision that would later seem either prescient or extreme, depending on who in the crew was describing it. He had cut and stacked a 3-day supply of fuel inside the Quonset's entrance vestibule, leaving the rest cached outside under a weighted tarp. If the entrance became inaccessible, he had calculated 3 days of interior supply would carry through the worst of it without requiring anyone to go out. The rest of the crew secured their tents with additional stakes and cordage and went to sleep expecting a rough night. What arrived was not a rough night. It was an event. The wind came from the northwest at approximately 11:30 p.m., oral accounts suggest, though the crew's sense of time deteriorated quickly in the hours that followed. It arrived not as a gradual increase, but as a threshold crossing. The air went from moving to hammering in what felt like under a minute, the way a faucet goes from drip to flood when a valve releases fully. The canvas of the nearest wall tent, occupied by Price and 2 other crew members, snapped taut and then immediately began vibrating at a frequency that made the poles ring like tuning forks. The sound was reported as extraordinarily loud. Not the low moan of a mountain wind, but a high, mechanical shrieking that the tent fabric amplified rather than absorbed. The first tent failed within 40 minutes. The failure was not dramatic. The windward stake pulled clean from the frozen ground. The frost had made the soil hard at the surface, but brittle at the interface with the stake shaft, and a lateral load transferred directly up the cordage and released the anchor without warning. Once one corner went, the geometry of the tent changed instantly. The pressure differential between windward and leeward faces ballooned the fabric inward on one side and sucked it outward on the other, and the pole along the ridge snapped. Not at a joint, but mid-shaft, in the kind of clean break that only happens when the load is applied faster than the material can flex to accommodate it. 3 men came out of that tent into 28 degrees Fahrenheit air and 65-mile-per-hour wind in the dark. The second tent held through the night, but lost its vestibule by 2 a.m., exposing the entrance to direct wind infiltration. By 3 a.m., interior temperatures had reportedly dropped to somewhere between 22 degrees Fahrenheit and 28 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the small camp stove running continuously at full output. Oral accounts from the survivors describe being able to see their breath clearly inside the tent and feeling cold through their sleeping bags within an hour of getting in, which indicates the sleeping system was losing thermal effectiveness as the ambient air dropped below its rated performance threshold. The third tent, the largest, managed to keep 2 men relatively functional through the night, but the crew chief Oren described waking repeatedly to take a windward corner that kept pulling, spending extended time outside in conditions that were, by his own later account, at the edge of what a properly dressed man could manage without risk of rapid heat loss. By first light, such as it was a thin gray brightening that barely distinguished morning from night, 4 of the 5 tents had been compromised in some significant way. 2 were effectively destroyed. One had lost its door system entirely. One was still standing, but had shed its rainfly and was conducting cold through the bare canvas at a rate that made it marginal at best. The storm was not over. It had, in a sense, barely started. The temperature at dawn on October 20th registered at 8 degrees Fahrenheit on the camp thermometer, a drop of 39 degrees from the previous morning's reading. The wind had not eased. The forecast, had anyone been able to receive one, would have shown the system parked over that canyon system for another 7 to 8 days. 7 people made their way to the Quonset before 8 in the morning. Callum opened the door and let them in without a word. The interior temperature at that moment, by his field log entry, was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not complete silence. The storm was audible, a constant low pressure against the outer wall, the occasional deep resonance of wind wrapping around the curved steel above them. But it was distant, managed, the kind of sound that told you the weather was real without making you feel like you were inside it. After hours in canvas that transmitted every gust as a physical vibration through the poles and fabric directly into the body of the shelter, the Quonset felt, one survivor would later describe it, like stepping into a different building material entirely. Like the difference between hearing music through a wall and standing inside the room where it's playing. The stone was doing that. A canvas wall is acoustically transparent in the same way it is thermally transparent. It has almost no mass to absorb or deflect sound energy, so it transmits vibration directly. The stone course is packed against the Quonset's exterior, added somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 pounds per linear foot of wall at their base. A mass so substantial that the wind's energy was absorbed and scattered before it could set the steel shell vibrating. The result was a shelter that felt structurally indifferent to what was happening outside, because it physically was. 7 people, their sleeping bags, and 3 days of compressed food and fuel now occupied a space roughly 16 feet long and 8 feet wide of the floor. It was not comfortable in any conventional sense. There was no room to stand in the lower third of the half-cylinder's interior, where the curved walls met the floor at a steep angle. The center ridge allowed a man of average height to stand upright in a narrow strip down the middle. The sleeping area was organized in 2 rows along the base, with gear stacked in the vestibule near the entrance and the small expedition stove positioned on a flat stone slab at the far end, its chimney pipe exiting through a flange hole in the Quonset's end wall that Callum had fabricated during the first week of camp. That stove detail mattered more than it appeared to. The chimney exit was positioned in the upper third of the end wall, not at the peak, but high enough that the draft created by the temperature differential between the interior and the cold exterior pulled combustion gases cleanly out without backflow. Callum had packed the gap around the flange with a clay and ash mixture that had hardened over weeks into a reasonably effective seal. There were no significant smoke infiltration reports in the field notes from the 10-day period, which suggests the draft geometry was functioning as intended even under the variable wind conditions of the storm. The stove ran for approximately 6 hours in every 24 during the first 3 days. 6 hours. In a canvas tent of comparable floor area, maintaining a survivable interior temperature of 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 55 degrees Fahrenheit during conditions of that severity would have required the stove to run nearly continuously, perhaps 18 to 20 hours per day, because every BTU produced was being lost through the transparent walls almost as fast as it was generated. The fuel consumption would have been unsustainable within 48 hours given the available supply. Inside the Quonset, the stone was doing most of the thermal work. During the 6 hours the stove burned each cycle, it was not primarily heating the air, though it did that too. It was recharging the interior surface of the stone wall, restoring the temperature of the interface to somewhere between 58 degrees Fahrenheit and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, from which it would slowly radiate back into the space over the following 18 hours while the stove sat cold. The air temperature inside cycled between approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit during the coldest pre-stove hours and approximately 67 degrees Fahrenheit in the hour after the stove had been running at full output, a range that was not luxurious but was, critically, well above the threshold at which the human body begins to lose core temperature in a resting state. The floor contributed as well. Callum had laid a base of flat stones directly on the ground inside the Quonset before the season began, covered with a thin layer of spruce boughs, and then their sleeping pads. The earth beneath that stone floor, at a depth of 6 to 8 inches, maintains a relatively stable temperature above freezing for most of the autumn season at that elevation, typically somewhere between 35 degrees Fahrenheit and 42 degrees Fahrenheit. That ground warmth conducted slowly upward through the stone floor and into the sleeping area, adding a diffuse but continuous heat source that required no fuel whatsoever. The men inside did not know all of this in those terms. What they knew was that the sleeping bags that had been marginal in the tents were performing well in the Quonset, that they woke up cold in the early morning hours, but not dangerously cold, that the water in the metal canteen hanging near the wall did not freeze overnight, something that had been a consistent problem in the tents even before the storm, that the space smelled of stone and smoke and spruce, and the particular human warmth of 7 bodies sharing a small shelter, and that smell, dense, mineral, organic, felt like evidence of something functioning. Outside, the storm continued without apology. Inside, the stone remembered every degree of heat it had ever been given, and it gave it back, hour by hour, through the longest 10 days that Valley had seen in a generation. The storm had a rhythm that the men inside the Quonset learned to read by the 3rd day, not by watching it. The single small window in the Quonset's end wall had frosted over completely within the first 12 hours and remained opaque for the duration. They read it through the stone itself, through the way the interior temperature behaved in the early morning hours before the stove was lit, through the sound profile of the wind, which shifted register as the pressure system moved and reorganized over the canyon, through the degree of condensation on the steel ceiling above them, which tracked the interior humidity and, by extension, the rate at which the stone walls were giving back their stored energy versus the rate at which the air was cooling despite them. By the morning of October 22nd, day 3, those indicators had shifted in a way that even the men without field experience could feel. The stove cycle the night before had run its standard 6 hours and been extinguished at approximately 11 p.m. By 4 a.m., the interior temperature had dropped to 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 to 8 degrees lower than the equivalent hour on the previous 2 nights. The stone walls were still radiating, but the rate of radiative output had slowed because the temperature differential between the stone's interior mass and the outside air had increased. The cold was pressing harder. The stone was responding, but the response was measurably slower. Callum noted the reading in his field log without commentary and lit the stove an hour earlier than usual. What was happening outside during those early hours of October 22nd was, by any regional standard, exceptional. Oral accounts from the rescue team that eventually reached the site described the conditions they found on approach. Wind crust hard enough to walk on in some exposed areas, drifted snowpack to window height against the tree lean on the north face of the canyon, and an ambient temperature reading on their equipment of -4 degrees Fahrenheit at mid-morning, with wind chill values that put effective exposure temperature somewhere below -25 degrees Fahrenheit. -4 degrees Fahrenheit ambient. Wind chill below -25 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the Quonset at that same hour, Callum's field log records 49 degrees Fahrenheit. A differential of 53 degrees between inside and outside, maintained not by a continuously running furnace, not by industrial insulation, but by approximately 4,000 pounds of stacked fieldstone and a small expedition stove burning for 6 hours out of every 24. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Modern well-insulated homes with active heating systems, natural gas furnaces, heat pumps, programmable thermostats, typically maintain interior temperatures of 68 degrees Fahrenheit to 72 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside reads -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The energy required to do that in a standard 1,500 square foot house is substantial. Rough estimates for continuous heating in those conditions run between 80,000 and 120,000 BTUs per hour, depending on construction quality and air sealing. The Quonset's interior space was roughly 100 square feet of floor area. But the principle is the same. The stone was performing a function that modern construction accomplishes with mechanical systems, ductwork, and a monthly utility bill. The stone cost nothing to run. It had been paid for in September, in sweat, hauling fieldstone down a hillside 40 yards at a time. Day 3 was also when the crew's psychological dynamic shifted in a way that several survivors later described with some discomfort. The shared space, 7 men, 100 square feet, sleeping in shifts, rationing fuel and food, had produced the predictable frictions of close-quarters confinement within the first 48 hours. Arguments about noise, about sleeping position, about the pace at which the food supply was being consumed. Price, who had been the loudest voice of skepticism about Callum's stone project in the weeks before the storm, had retreated into a conspicuous silence that was clearly not comfort, but a kind of recalibration. A man updating his model of the world against data that his previous model had not accounted for. On the morning of day 3, when the stove was lit early and the temperature began climbing back from 41 degrees Fahrenheit towards something livable, Price reportedly said nothing for a long time. Then, according to 2 separate survivor accounts, he asked Callum a single question. "How did you know it would be this bad?" Callum fed a piece of split spruce into the stove and closed the door before answering. "I didn't know it would be this bad," he said. "I knew it could be. That's enough." The distinction between those 2 statements, between certainty and sufficient probability, is the entire philosophy of traditional shelter engineering compressed into a single exchange. The builders of thick-walled stone structures across centuries of human habitation were not responding to storms they had predicted. They were building for storms they understood were possible. They were not optimizing for the average winter. They were engineering for the worst one they could reasonably expect. The stone wall was Callum's answer to that probability. And on day 3, when the real cold arrived and pressed against the outer shell with everything it had, the stone did not yield. It slowed. It gave back less per hour than it had on day 1. The temperature cycling inside became wider, colder before the stove, warmer immediately after, as the thermal mass gradually approached equilibrium with the sustained exterior temperature. But it did not fail. It kept fighting, degree by degree, through the worst hours that storm produced. The storm broke on October 28th. Not dramatically. There was no single moment of silence, no sudden clearing, no shaft of sunlight through the frosted window. The wind simply began to ease, degree by degree, the way it had arrived, as a pressure change rather than an event. The sound profile shifted over the course of an afternoon from the sustained mechanical roar of a system fully engaged to something more intermittent, gusty, recognizable as ordinary mountain weather rather than a meteorological siege. By the evening of October 28th, Callum cracked the Quonset's entrance door for the first time in 6 days. The temperature outside was 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature inside was 52 degrees Fahrenheit. 10 days. -4 degrees Fahrenheit at the worst point. A differential that had never, at any recorded hour during the event, dropped below 45 degrees between inside and outside. 7 people, all functional, none requiring medical intervention beyond minor cold-related discomfort. Fuel consumption for the entire 10-day period. 11 days' worth of a single expedition stove running at roughly 6 hours per day. A total burn time of approximately 60 to 65 hours across the full event. 65 hours of active stove operation to survive 10 days in conditions that reached -4 degrees Fahrenheit ambient. That fuel efficiency number is the one that demands the most attention, because it is the clearest single metric of what the stone actually accomplished. It is not a comfort figure. It is a survival figure. In a canvas tent of equivalent floor area under equivalent conditions, maintaining a marginally survivable interior temperature would have required something closer to 180 to 220 hours of stove operation over the same period. 3 to 3.5 times more fuel than was available in the camp's total supply. The tents were not just inadequate. They were structurally incompatible with survival at that duration and temperature. The stone had not merely made things more comfortable. It had closed the gap between the available fuel supply and the energy required to stay alive. Understanding why requires tracking what happened to the thermal mass over the full 10-day arc. Not just the first dramatic days, but the slow middle period that field accounts describe with less drama but equal significance. During days 1 through 3, the stone walls were drawing down the thermal energy they had accumulated over 6 weeks of September sun exposure. The interface of the wall was radiating at a relatively high rate because the stored mass temperature, somewhere between 55 degrees Fahrenheit and 62 degrees Fahrenheit deep in the stone, was well above the air temperature inside the shelter, which cycled between 41 degrees Fahrenheit and 67 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on stove state. That differential drove strong radiant output, and the stone was doing most of the thermal heavy lifting with minimal stove support. By days 4 through 6, the stored solar charge had been substantially depleted. The stone's interior mass temperature had dropped closer to 48 degrees Fahrenheit to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, reducing the radiant differential and slowing the passive output. This is the period when the stove became more important. It was no longer supplementing the stone so much as actively recharging it, cycling the inner wall face temperature back up every 24 hours so the radiant contribution could continue. Days 7 through 10 represented a new equilibrium. The stone was no longer operating on its original solar charge. That energy was gone. What it was doing instead was acting as a thermal buffer, absorbing the heat generated by the stove during burn cycles, holding it, and releasing it slowly during the 18-hour cold intervals between burns. The stone had transitioned from a primary heat source into a secondary storage and distribution system, but that function was still providing somewhere between 30% and 45% of the interior's thermal stability during the coldest overnight hours, by Callum's own rough estimates recorded in the field log. The stone never stopped contributing. It just changed roles as its original energy source was consumed. This stage behavior, primary radiator, then rechargeable buffer, is what distinguished the Quonset from every other shelter in that camp. The canvas tents had no such staging. They had no storage capacity. Every hour of heat was an independent event, disconnected from the hour before it and after it. The Quonset stone shell created a thermal continuity, a through line of warmth that persisted across the dead hours of the night when the stove was cold and the storm was at its worst, because there was always something in those walls that still had energy left to give. Patience, in building terms, is mass. The structures that survive extreme conditions longest are not necessarily the ones with the best insulation at any given moment. They're the ones that can absorb the most energy over time and release it most slowly when the conditions demand it. Stone buildings in cold climates, from the Brock Towers of the Scottish Islands to the thick-walled farmhouses of the Norwegian interior, from the Barabara shelters of the Aleutian peoples to the sod-over timber dugouts of the Great Plains homesteaders, all operated on this same principle, adjusted for available material. The mass was different. The physics was identical. Callum had not invented anything. He had remembered something that the weight-conscious, transport-optimized, efficiency-prioritized logic of modern field equipment had quietly set aside. And for 10 days in a canyon that the rescue team later described as one of the most severe sustained cold events they had documented in 40 years of regional operations, that remembered principle had kept 7 people alive on 65 hours of stove fuel. The math was not complicated. The discipline to act on it before the storm arrived. That was the hard part. The rescue team reached the site on October 30th, 2 days after the storm broke. They came in on snowshoes, a 4-man crew from the Regional Emergency Services Unit, carrying additional fuel, medical supplies, and a radio relay unit that could finally punch a signal through to the base station at the valley floor. They had been attempting to reach the camp since October 24th and had been turned back twice by conditions on the approach route. Their after-action report, filed with the regional office in the weeks following the event, contains an observation that is worth quoting in relevant summary. The team noted finding 5 shelters in various states of destruction and 1 structure fully intact, with 7 survivors in stable condition, thermal and physical state consistent with manageable exposure rather than emergency medical status. Manageable exposure. That phrase, in the language of cold weather emergency response, is a significant distinction. It means no frostbite requiring intervention. No hypothermia, presenting as confusion or loss of coordination. No core temperature depression, requiring rewarming protocols. 7 men who had spent 10 days in conditions reaching -4 degrees Fahrenheit ambient were cold, fatigued, low on food, and ready to leave, but they were not injured. They had not been in a survival emergency in the clinical sense. They had been in a very uncomfortable situation that their shelter had made survivable. The difference between those two outcomes, clinical emergency versus uncomfortable but stable, is measured in degrees and hours. Specifically, in the degrees of temperature that the stone maintained above the danger threshold, and in the hours across which it maintained them without requiring fuel that did not exist. Price left the site without saying much. Several survivor accounts mention that he helped Callum dismantle part of the stone wall during the hours before the rescue team arrived. Not because it needed to come down, but because it was the kind of work that needed doing, and it was, apparently, the only adequate response he could find to 10 days of evidence that had thoroughly revised his understanding of what fieldwork preparation actually required. Orrin filed a detailed supplemental report that went beyond the standard incident summary. In it, he described Callum's construction approach in enough technical detail that the Regional Survey Authority later referenced it in updated equipment guidance for high-altitude seasonal camps, recommending that prefabricated shelters in exposed locations be supplemented with available mass material where terrain permitted, and that thermal storage considerations be incorporated into seasonal camp planning alongside the standard equipment lists. That guidance exists in some form in regional field protocols today. But the lesson that Callum's stone Quonset teaches is not really about Quonset huts. It is not about any specific shelter type or any specific material. The lesson is about a way of thinking about heat, one that industrial modernity has made increasingly difficult to access because the infrastructure of modern heating removes the need to think about it all. When heat arrives at the touch of a thermostat, there is no reason to think about where it comes from or how fast it leaves. The system handles the problem invisibly. And invisible problems are problems that disappear from human understanding over time. Not because they are solved, but because the systems that manage them are so reliable that the underlying physics stops being personally legible. People stop knowing in their bodies and in their decision-making what it means to be responsible for their own thermal environment. The traditional builders knew. The Scottish stonemason who added an extra 18 inches to the exterior wall of a Highland longhouse was not following a building code. He was accounting for a winter he had survived before and intended to survive again. The Pueblo craftsman who oriented a south-facing masonry wall to capture maximum winter sun was not following passive solar design guidelines from a textbook. He was applying observed physical behavior to a material he understood through generations of accumulated practice. The Aleutian builder who half-buried a Barabara shelter in the earth to use the ground's stable temperature as a thermal anchor was not implementing an engineering principle he had learned in a classroom. He was solving a problem with the materials and knowledge available to him, and solving it correctly. Callum was in that lineage, not because he had studied those traditions academically, though local accounts suggest he had encountered several of them through years of reading and conversation with older field hands, but because he had developed the same underlying orientation, the belief that a shelter's job is not just to keep the weather out, but to hold energy in, to be, in the deepest physical sense, on your side. Modern construction excels at keeping weather out. Vapor barriers, waterproof membranes, airtight window systems. These are remarkable achievements. But the thermal mass that traditional builders instinctively incorporated, the weight, the density, the stored energy, has largely been engineered away in the pursuit of lighter, faster, cheaper. A modern stick-frame house with fiberglass insulation and a gas furnace will keep you comfortable in nearly any condition. Until the gas stops, until the power fails, until the storm lasts 10 days and the fuel supply runs out on day 4. At that point, the question is not whether your house has a good R value. The question is whether it remembers heat. Callum's did. And in the end, that was the only question that mattered. Educational and historical content. This screenplay is intended for documentary storytelling purposes only and does not constitute engineering, construction, or survival advice. Always consult qualified professionals before undertaking field construction or emergency preparedness planning.